Hello and welcome back to the France Made Simple podcast, where I aim and hope to simplify and demystify life in France and make it that bit more enjoyable for those of you that are already living here and inspire those of you that are thinking about moving here to actually make that move and dive on in to life in France. Anyway, today, bit of a contentious one here, but it's something that comes up quite a lot. And the question is, are the French rude? Well, again, that's a kind of, how long's a piece of string, chicken and egg, yes and no kind of answer. So if somebody asked me to respond to that question, I would have to say yes and no. And I'll dive into why I think that during the course of this episode. But it is something that comes up again and again on all of my social media channels, on the website, and people, often post about the French being, as they term it, rude. And I don't think it is rudeness. I think it's just cultural differences. And I think this is something that it's quite easy to lose sight of when you move to another country, especially a country that is geographically as close to the UK as France is. It's probably different for people coming from further afield, Americans or Australians, for example. I think if you travel a vast distance, you expect things to be very different. But when you just kind of hop over the channel, you kind of expect things to be pretty much the same, and they're just not. So let's have a think about this. And as I said at the start, my answer would have to be yes and no. And I think the yes comes in terms of our British perceptions as to what is and isn't polite, and what does and doesn't qualify as being rude. Now, I think first of all, the French have a reputation for being extremely polite because there are a lot of social mores to consider in France. The whole thing about saying bonjour to everybody when you enter a bar or a shop, shaking hands, doing la bise. It comes across as a very polite society, but that isn't the whole story. Now, it took me a very, very, very long time, I'm embarrassed to say, to realise that I was never going to get anywhere asking anybody to do anything for me in France in a commercial or customer service situation if I hadn't started my conversation with a bonjour. And if you've met that person before, even if you don't know them particularly well, it has to be bonjour followed by how are you? Comment allez-vous? And then you get into the whole, yeah, I'm okay, ça va, ça va. Then you might even have to chat about the weather. All of that needs to happen before you can actually ask that question and ask them for help, assistance, or to do what they were flipping meant to have done in the first place in the case of customer service. So bear that one in mind. And if you don't go through that process, you will get people on the back foot and you'll get their backs up before you've even started asking for their help or assistance. So it's very, very important to follow those guidelines. Now, this also applies in social situations, I think. And I noticed this for the first time maybe 3-4 years ago. Quite a close friend of mine had left the area and gone to work in Paris, and he'd been away for 3-4 months, and then he came back and he was staying with us. Didn't have a car for the weekend, so I drove him to meet up with a load of his friends who also hadn't seen him for 3-4 months. They were all obviously delighted to see him, but it made me kind of smirk to myself how the conversation went down. For the first 20 minutes, it was all really general discussion about the weather, where everybody had been on holiday, really kind of bland chit chat. Nobody dove in and asked that kind of, so how's life up there? How's the job? Have you met anybody? Kind of questions. Whereas certainly for British people, if we met up with friends after a period of time and hadn't seen each other, we'd be straight in there with, so have you found a girl? What's the nightlife like? Is your boss awful? We wouldn't go through that sort of social construct of asking about the weather and all of that kind of stuff for 20 minutes first, but the French do. And I've talked about apéro etiquette before, and this is also true when you go for an apéro. Nobody will shove a drink in your hand as you walk through the door. There'll be general chit chat and polite admiration of the surroundings, the environment, the discussion of the garden. You may even get a tour of the garden. Then you proceed to the apéro. And it's not that, well, I suppose the Brits do have a reputation for being terrible lushes bordering on alcoholics. It's not necessarily that you want to get your hands on a glass of wine immediately. It's just I'm used to, in that kind of social situation, being given a drink first before we get into the chit chat. But that would be considered by the French to be really, really rude. If I walked over, grabbed a drink and started gulping it, that would be a social no, an absolute faux pas. So I think it's just different expectations. And having said that, it is quite hard when you come from a different culture to accept those new kind of rules. I've talked about how if you go into, excuse me, and for example, a reception desk scenario or an office or something, for me, as the customer, as the client, I expect the person behind that desk to look up, make eye contact, say hello, and deal with me immediately. And this often just doesn't happen in France. That person may be on the phone, typing away. They may even have their back to you working on their computer, and they will not turn, acknowledge, engage with you until they've finished doing what they're doing. I mean, for British people, even if somebody, the receptionist is on the phone to another customer, they will still at least make that eye contact with you and kind of gesture that, hang on a minute, I'll be with you in a second kind of thing. I think that's normal and it's polite to acknowledge to me. And for a long time, it really aggravated me when the French didn't do that. But I've come to realise that that's just the way it is. So you just have to work with it. So we've talked about customer service and we've talked about the kind of, the formality of going through that initial introductory thing before you can get down to business. And this applies in meetings, in social situations, anywhere and everywhere. And then there are gestures, which, I found again, I've got used to it now, 22 years here and living in an entirely French household, I'm pretty immune to most things, is the finger wagging. That used to send me into orbit. I found it very admonitory. And then I've heard lots of other people say that the sort of Gallic shoulder shrugging is very offhand. And yet you can see it like that, or you can just accept that that's something the French do that we, the British, don't do. And I'm sure Americans, Australians, Scandinavians, Germans, they all do other stuff that other cultures might find equally difficult to tolerate or to swallow. So again, I think it's cultural differences and you just have to kind of be aware and accept and understand. Now, then there's the whole what's polite and what isn't polite to discuss. And that's where, again, cultural differences really come into play. Now, I found that the French are quite happy to pose really what I would consider really personal, bordering on the rude type of questions. And we were at a barbecue over the summer and I was there with my partner and his 15-year-old son. We hadn't met, apart from the host, we hadn't met any of the people at this barbecue. None of them knew us. None of them knew any of our background. But during the course of the evening, on 5 different occasions, people asked questions that were so kind of personal and probing that I heard my partner telling them that yes, he was divorced and had 3 children, and I was divorced or divorcing and have 3 children, and know that the child there wasn't our child, it was his child, which actually I thought was quite uncomfortable making for the child. And I said to him at the end of the evening, like, bloody hell, that was a bit intrusive, wasn't it? And he said, Yeah, actually, now you come to mention it, I'd never stopped to think about it before, but yeah, it was quite intrusive. And I said, 5 different conversations, you were obliged to kind of explain our background. And I said, that would just never happen in the UK. Even if I was somewhere and I met a couple with, kids, a family, or whatever, and even if I thought, oh, that's a bit of an odd setup, I might think that to myself, but I would wait until I was in the car on the way home to say to my other half or friend or whoever, oh, what did you think of them? I mean, I didn't think they were married, or, how long have they been together or something, if I was really that nosy. But I would never, ever ask people directly. And, that's something that I'm just not used to. And because I don't like it and I do find it intrusive, I do consider it rude. And I haven't yet got to accepting that. Um, and the other question people often ask is, why did you move to France? Well, okay, that's not rude because it's just information gathering. Maybe it's just curiosity. But if you're not in the kind of mental space to want to answer that question, again, it can feel really intrusive because people have all kinds of different reasons. And, often those reasons are not necessarily what you want to discuss or divulge in public. But the French are very happy to ask that question. I think maybe because more Anglo-Saxons emigrate to France than French people emigrate to Anglo-Saxon countries. So they're just a bit, perplexed, baffled, confused. They want to know the answer. It's not rude at all as they see it. But for us, it can feel quite invasive. So my advice here is you are going to get asked that question, and if your truthful answer is, or why did you move to this particular town, village, area, whatever, and if your actual answer is, oh, because at the age of 55 I discovered that my husband was shagging his co-worker who's half his age, and you don't want to share that with the group at large, make sure you've got your little sort of off script answer off pat, and you can kind of say, well, I've always loved this region, and who wouldn't want to live amongst the bucolic orchards of Calvados or the stunning mountains of wherever the fine mountains, who knows, or I'd always dreamed of buying a place and renovating it, and I suddenly realised that life was passing me by, so I thought, well, if I don't go for it now, I never will. And who wouldn't want to live here? But make sure you have your answer, or an answer that you feel comfortable giving, ready to go, because those kind of questions can take you by surprise simply because they are so personal. And there are no barriers with the French when it comes to us asking personal questions. I remember a few months ago when my partner was undergoing medical treatment, she has turned out to be a good friend and somebody I really like and respect, but I hardly knew her at the time. And she came round for a cup of coffee in the morning. You couldn't even say there was alcohol involved, so that might have loosened people's inhibitions, and promptly asked if we were still having sex and was he up to it. And my British personality just went, yeah, we don't talk about those kind of things. So, the British are more reserved. If we get incandescently angry, we are likely to say, that made me quite cross, which actually means I want to fucking kill you. Americans are super polite, apart from when they're shooting each other, obviously. And I think for Americans who are super polite and expect people to be super polite back to them in terms of customer service, France can be a bit of a baptism by fire. And so if you're an American out there listening to this, thinking about moving to France, just file that one away and remember it's nothing personal. Nobody's out to get you personally. That's just the way the French are. And the same goes for service in bars and restaurants. I mean, the snooty French waiter is a stereotype. But I think that also comes down to this kind of cultural value within society that we are all equal and everybody, it's the liberté, fraternité, égalité. And just because you're a waiter doesn't mean, quite rightly, in my opinion, doesn't mean you should take shit from anybody, customers included. Now, obviously, some waiters carry that too far and kind of exude that I am doing you the most incredible favour by even bringing your bread to the table. So don't even think about asking me for some butter to go with it. But it is a thing. And again, there's pros and cons with every country, pluses and minuses, swings and roundabouts, blah, 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 blah. It's just France and it's just the French. So personal questions, be prepared for those, and also be prepared for the French to share all kinds of personal shit, literally, with you. They have no filter whatsoever when talking about bodily functions. The first time I met my son-in-law and I went to his flat. My daughter wasn't living there full time at the time. We went round for a cup of tea. It was all very nice, very civilised, sat in the nice armchair having a cup of tea. And I complimented him on his English, which was very good. And he said he'd travelled a lot and that was why. And then he started telling me about his travels. I was asking questions. And within the first 20 minutes of meeting this dude, he had told me about the time that he got the shits in Thailand and had ingested an entire packet of Imodium and then was unable to go to the bathroom for 2 weeks. And I was sitting there like, okay, that's a lot of information. My daughter was howling because, she knew him, knew he has no filter, knew that the French generally have no filter, and just thought it was really funny. And he was completely oblivious. He saw absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever in discussing his problematic bowel functions with his future mother-in-law. And I've been through all of that with my partner over the last few months. The level of detail that him and his friends go into, I just sit there and I'm gobsmacked. And it's become a running joke between us now, that, because I've explained that we just don't talk about those kind of things in the UK. It's just not done. And I think he thinks we're all uptight and inhibited, and I don't see that as rude now. I just see it as another difference. Equally, whilst the French are very happy to talk about their bodily functions and go into more detail than you'd ever want to hear, doesn't apply to periods. That's like, oh, no, 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 we do not talk about girl stuff. It's a bit like 1970s England, when the period adverts weren't allowed to use anything red, and we had to imply that people could roller skate along beaches being towed by Dalmatians whilst flying a kite. And there was some reason for this, but we couldn't go into the detail of why that might be happening. So yeah, they're quite uptight and reserved about that. And I'm sure they would think that maybe, us Anglo-Saxons that merrily discuss our ovulation and follicles and whatever, and our flow rates, that we are very, very rude. So all that to say, are the French rude? Yes and no. No more than the British or the Americans or the Germans or the Australians or the Italians or the Brazilians. Every culture has its quirks, and just remember, when you move here and when you're living here, what you might think of as rude is just French. Try and embrace it, try and enjoy it. Excuse me. And if there are things that you really don't like about it, you don't have to accept those, much like I didn't accept the final person at that barbecue asking me about our relationship status. I just kind of made it quite clear that this was a subject that was not up for discussion, and actually we were on our way anyway. That was my personal boundary, and I think that's absolutely fine. But generally, you just have to go with the flow. No pun intended, not talking about periods. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. I wouldn't, maybe informative. Hope it's given you something to think about, discuss, debate, and tune in next time when I will be. Oh, I think we've got a couple of guests coming up, but I think before that we'll be doing some more of our where to live episodes, because that's something that is people are coming back to me time and time again with questions on areas and regions, and the episode I did on sort of coast v countryside was very popular. So with that in mind, don't forget to follow, like, share, tell your friends, tell your neighbours, tell your enemies. We're not fussy. Spread the word. The podcast is beginning to get quite big now, which is really amazing for me, as it's something I started very much not knowing whether it would be of interest to the listeners or not. So thank you all for your lovely comments and kind words. Keep them coming. Keep following, keep listening, and don't forget our lovely, lovely sponsors, Fab French Insurance, who will help make your life as simple as Frenchly possible. And as Fabienne's team are all entirely Anglo-Saxon or English speaking, you will get proper Anglo-Saxon customer service. So lots of polite acknowledgement and instant answers to any queries. Thank you for listening, and see you next time. Bye bye.